The courtroom was silent. The jury watched as Officer Mark Reynolds, a decorated cop, took the stand. His voice was steady, his uniform crisp, his lie well rehearsed. "I saw the suspect resisting arrest," he said, his tone unwavering. "She was aggressive. We had no choice but to use force." Across the room, Naomi Carter sat motionless, her hands folded neatly on her lap. Her expression was blank, too blank. The public saw a helpless black woman, a victim of police brutality, falsely accused and outmatched. But what they didn't know, Naomi Carter wasn't helpless. She was a U.S. Navy SEAL, and this cop had just made the worst mistake of his life. Officer Mark Reynolds stepped down from the witness stand, his smirk barely concealed. His testimony had gone exactly as planned. The jury had seen a black woman, bruised and powerless, sitting before them. In their minds, the case was clear. She had resisted, and the officers had done their job. Naomi Carter's public defender whispered, "We don't have much to fight this with. It's your word against theirs." Naomi didn't react. She simply stared at Reynolds, her mind cold, calculating. She had endured weeks of whispers, racist remarks, and fabricated evidence. The system was built to crush people like her, but they didn't know who they were up against. Naomi had spent years in the most brutal combat training on the planet. She had learned how to withstand torture, deceive her enemies, and dismantle threats with surgical precision. Her body still carried scars from classified missions, scars she had earned fighting wars most Americans didn't even know existed. Now, she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting to bring down the entire corrupt machine that had framed her. As the judge banged the gavel and adjourned for the day, Reynolds walked past Naomi's table, leaning just close enough to mutter under his breath, "Enjoy prison, sweetheart." Naomi didn't blink. She just smiled. The hunt had begun. As the courtroom emptied, Naomi remained seated, her fingers lightly tapping on the table. Control the breathing, control the mind, anticipate the next move. These were lessons drilled into her as a Navy SEAL. Panic was the enemy, patience was the weapon. Mark Reynolds thought he had won. That was his first mistake. Naomi had spent the last 6 weeks gathering information while pretending to be helpless. Every guard, every corrupt lawyer, every falsified document, she had cataloged them all. She had pieced together the conspiracy, and now she was ready to tear it apart. Her plan required precision. As she walked out of the courtroom, a man in a tailored suit fell in step beside her. His voice was calm, businesslike. "Miss Carter, my name is Daniel Grant. I work in corporate intelligence. Let's talk." She didn't respond, just glanced at him, assessing. Daniel Grant, she knew that name. Former Wall Street shark, now working in deep-level investigations. But why was he here? He handed her a card. "I know what Reynolds did. I know who he's covering for. And I know you're not the victim they think you are." Naomi raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Daniel smiled. "There's a bigger game being played here. It's not just about you, it's about power, about money, about control." He paused. "Reynolds is just a pawn." Now he had her attention. As Naomi took the card, she noticed something. Daniel had slipped her a USB drive along with it. No words, no explanations, just a challenge in his eyes. She walked away without looking back. Back at her apartment, she locked the door, pulled out an old, untraceable laptop, and plugged in the drive. Files, dozens of them. Reynolds wasn't just dirty. He was deeply embedded in a corporate police pipeline that had been covering up crimes for years. There were names, judges, politicians, CEOs, people who made men like Reynolds feel untouchable, but they weren't untouchable. Naomi exhaled slowly, a sharp, lethal smile forming on her lips. They had spent so much time underestimating her. Now, it was her turn to make a move. Naomi leaned back, eyes scanning the damning files on the screen. Names, transactions, case cover-ups. It was all there. The entire system was rotten to the core. But the question was, who was at the top? Reynolds was just a foot soldier. Someone much more powerful was pulling the strings. She took a deep breath, switching her mindset from survival to strategy. War wasn't always fought with guns. Sometimes it was fought with information. The first step was simple: expose Reynolds. She needed leverage, not just evidence, a spectacle. Naomi pulled out an old encrypted phone, connected to a server only a handful of people in the world had access to. Within minutes, she had sent 3 messages. One to an ex-SEAL teammate, a cyber intelligence specialist. One to a former journalist, now an independent whistleblower, and one to Daniel Grant. Then she waited. Her laptop beeped, a response. The journalist had dug into Reynolds' background. He wasn't just dirty, he was protected. His rise in the force had been suspiciously fast. Complaints against him vanished. A trail of valence followed his promotions, but every case against him had mysteriously disappeared. Someone had been cleaning up his messes for years. But why? Naomi's phone vibrated again. Daniel. Meet me in an hour. This goes higher than I thought. An hour later, Naomi walked into a dimly lit parking garage. Daniel was waiting near a sleek black sedan. No words, no greetings. He simply handed her another file. She flipped it open and froze. A name. A single name at the top of it all. William Aldridge, CEO, power broker, kingmaker. A billionaire with deep connections in law enforcement, government contracts, and corporate security. He wasn't just protecting Reynolds. He was running an entire criminal enterprise through the justice system itself. Naomi felt her pulse steady. So this was her real target. Daniel exhaled. Taking down Reynolds is easy, but if you want the whole system to burn... He met her gaze. You need to go straight for Aldridge. Naomi smiled. A slow, dangerous smile. Then, let's bring the empire down. Naomi knew that a man like William Aldridge didn't just survive in the shadows. He thrived in them. A CEO with political ties, police loyalty, and corporate muscle at his disposal. He had built an empire where every problem disappeared before it could reach the surface. But Naomi wasn't a problem. She was a reckoning. She and Daniel sat in a safe house, the dim glow of multiple screens illuminating the room. A live feed played on one screen. Officer Mark Reynolds, oblivious, sitting at a high-end restaurant, laughing with colleagues. On another screen, banking transactions showed Aldridge moving money into offshore accounts. Daniel's voice was low. Aldridge never gets his hands dirty. He uses people like Reynolds as disposable shields. If we take down Reynolds too early, Aldridge will cut his losses and erase the rest. Naomi's fingers tapped against the table. She needed a trap. Aldridge's greatest strength was control. His greatest weakness? His ego. She had to make him believe he was still in control, right up until the moment he lost everything. A plan formed. It had to be executed in 3 moves. The first, destabilize Reynolds. Naomi sent a file to an anonymous news source. Footage of Reynolds attacking an unarmed man 2 years ago, the case buried by Aldridge. Within hours, the media erupted. Hashtags, protests, and political outrage exploded overnight. Reynolds was still free, but for the first time, he was vulnerable. The second, force Aldridge's hand. Naomi had learned a long time ago. Men like Aldridge didn't just react to threats, they erased them. If he thought Reynolds would talk, he would eliminate him before he could. which is why she sent an anonymous tip to one of Aldridge's closest enforcers. Reynolds has been compromised. He's talking. Within hours, Reynolds panicked. His home was raided by his own people. He barely escaped, now a fugitive from the very system that once protected him. The final move: bait Aldridge. Naomi crafted an untraceable message directly to him. "You've lost control. Come find me if you think you can fix it." She attached one last thing: a live location. If Aldridge wanted to silence her, he would have to come himself. And when he did, he would realize too late. She had already won. The location Naomi sent was deliberate. A high-rise penthouse under an alias, wired with surveillance, escape routes mapped. This wasn't a battle of strength. This was a war of strategy. Aldridge would come. Not because he was reckless, but because he was arrogant. Men like him always believed they were untouchable. Naomi stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the city lights. Every detail was accounted for. The room was bugged, cameras in place, exit strategies secured. She had lured in warlords before. A corporate kingpin was no different. The private elevator chimed. Aldridge stepped in like he owned the world. Because for years, he had. Flanked by 2 bodyguards, his tailored suit barely creased as he strode forward. His face was unreadable, but Naomi knew better. His pulse was racing. She turned, arms crossed. "You took your time." Aldridge studied her, then let out a quiet chuckle. "I'll admit I underestimated you. That was my mistake." Naomi tilted her head. "Your first mistake. There's been a few." Aldridge exhaled, pacing. "You should have taken the loss. Walked away. You think you're untouchable? The people I own, the people I command, they don't care about rules, they don't care about justice." Naomi let him talk, because men like Aldridge always revealed their own downfall. Then she played her trump card. She pulled out a sleek phone, pressed a button. A voice recording echoed through the room, his voice. "Get rid of Reynolds, he's dead weight, and Carter, make her disappear." Aldridge's bodyguard stiffened, his jaw clenched. "Where did you get that?" Naomi smiled, slow and deliberate. "I have everything, Aldridge. The payments, the orders, the cover-ups. You're done." His hand twitched, maybe reaching for a gun, maybe thinking of a way out. But then another sound. Sirens, helicopters, footsteps in the stairwell. Naomi's backup had arrived. Aldridge turned, his empire crumbling around him. For the first time, Naomi saw something in his eyes she had never expected. Fear. She leaned in, her voice soft but lethal. "You thought I was helpless. That was your last mistake." The door burst open. Armed agents swarmed in. William Aldridge was done. And Naomi Carter? She was just getting started. The moment Aldridge was dragged away in cuffs, Naomi felt the weight of years of corruption, power, and deception collapsing like a dying empire. Justice wasn't about courtroom victories. It was about dismantling the very foundations of power, and she had just cracked open an entire system. She stepped onto the rooftop of the high-rise, breathing in the crisp night air as the city roared beneath her. The helicopters hovered, flashing red and blue lights onto the skyline. Officers and federal agents swarmed the building, securing every floor, collecting evidence, taking down names. Daniel Grant walked up beside her, slipping his hands into his coat pockets. "You really did it?" Naomi smirked, but there was no triumph in her eyes. We just started. Aldridge's empire wasn't built in a day, and it wouldn't fully collapse overnight. There were still others: judges, politicians, corporate allies, people who had turned a blind eye or helped bury the evidence. She had cut the head off the snake, but the body still writhed. Daniel studied her for a moment. "You're not going back to your old life, are you?" She exhaled slowly. "I don't think that life exists anymore." She had spent years fighting battles in the shadows. But this? This was personal. The media would feast on Aldridge's fall. More people would come forward. More secrets would unravel. And Naomi Carter wasn't going to stop until every last corrupt pillar of his empire was burned to the ground. Her phone buzzed, a secured line. She answered. A familiar voice came through. "You made some powerful enemies tonight." Naomi smiled. "Good." There was silence on the other end. Then the voice continued. "If you're serious about this, there's more work to be done." She glanced at Daniel, then at the city stretching before her, endless and full of shadows. "Send me everything you have," she said. "Let's finish what we started." The call ended. Naomi tucked the phone away, her heartbeat steady, her purpose clearer than ever. They had tried to bury her, silence her, erase her. Now, she was the one writing the rules, and for those still lurking in the darkness, thinking they were untouchable, she was coming for them next. The hunt wasn't over. It had just begun.